And welcome everyone to this week's edition of Tech Sales Advice. My name, of course, is Chris White, and I am absolutely delighted to welcome Mr. Bryan Karr. Bryan, for those of you who don't know, Bryan is a director of solution consulting with a company called Insurium. I hope I'm saying that right, Bryan. He's
Yeah,
also
you
the
got it.
founder. He's also the founder of BCK Careers, which is an online coaching and consulting organization where he helps folks with their career. Bryan, I know you're going to talk about that a little bit. And you've just recently been appointed, if I can use that term, or invited to be an ambassador for Presales Collective. Bryan, welcome, sir. How are you?
Great, Chris. Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm excited to be here.
Well, it's absolutely my pleasure. And you, by the way, he also lives in one of my favorite places in this country, which is in Denver, Colorado. So I'm horribly jealous of that. Every time I'm in Colorado, I absolutely love it. And Bryan, let me just take a minute to welcome anybody who might be joining us. If we have folks on now, of course, as always, I welcome you to say hello. You'll be, more than welcome to ask questions of Bryan or myself. Bryan, in the unlikely event anybody who may be listening to this does not know who you are, I've
Yeah.
introduced you for a moment, but do you mind taking another minute and just sort of sharing a little bit on yourself?
Yeah, I'll give a bit of background on me, and I think it'll also kind of help paint a story for some of the stuff we'll talk about later. But so my background is actually in mechanical engineering. Went to school for that. Thought I was going to study like material science, get into like deep metallurgy, kind of crystal and structure formation of of metals and 3D printing. And then now I'm in pre-sales, and I work in the insurance technology side of the industry. And never would have thought that I made this progression, but kind of along that journey, had worked at a couple of different organizations and made my path from hardware kind of pre-sales into then more of a software based organization. And along that way, kind of fell in love with what the pre-sales profession is, just because you get to touch so many parts of a business. So ultimately why I got an MBA to kind of build out that business acumen on the back end. But
Yeah.
yeah, I love everything pre-sales. I love telling the stories. My friends always give me a hard time because I make everything a story, it seems like, when we're hanging out with one another. And I think that's due to the job. But the other side of it is the career coaching bit. And kind of a sneak peek, I guess, what we're going to talk about later is that I think the storytelling of pre-sales is very, very similar and very transferable to the storytelling of the job hunt, right? Like what your resume is, what your experience is, why you want that next job. And so excited to talk about that today.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's interesting you should mention that. I've always thought that really the interview conversation, right? The interview process. I mean, in essence, you're selling yourself, right? So the way you come across in the interview is really how you're going to come across to your prospects and customers. Like you said, we'll get there in a minute. So I want to go back to, so you were actually, you studied to be a mechanical engineer. So coming out of school, you thought you were going to be a mechanical engineer designing metal and building stuff. And now you find yourself running pre-sales for an insurance tech company. Sort of at what point along that journey did you, what was there a moment where you went, wait a minute, I think I want to do this instead of bend metal for a living? What was there
Yeah.
sort of a moment like that?
There was. I mean, it's like I can't like nail down the specific day and time,
Yeah.
but throughout my education and throughout kind of that early part of my career, I realized like I could do the math, I could do the science, I could figure stuff out and kind of crunch the numbers, if you will, to come up with what the answer was,
Yeah.
so what the solution was. But I loved and it was always just such a small part of that is like, okay, once you did it, what does that mean? Who are you presenting this to? Where's that solution going to be kind of transferred into? How are they going to use it? How are they going to apply it? All of that. And so kind of with that realization, I started like, okay, I need to be more customer facing. I need to be out there with clients. It started with kind of like a project engineering role, which was
Yeah.
like that hybrid of the technical, but also client facing, to then just a full sales engineering focused with Emerson, where that was an interesting one where I worked in, and this is kind of really where it took off. I worked in their flow automation solution. So I was working like one day I'd work with, Chevron and their refineries out in the California coast. And then I'd bounce up to Seattle and be talking to Blue Origin about their, crazy, rocket propulsion applications that we were helping them out with. And then I would talk to like Mission Tortillas about their their tortilla manufacturing line. And I loved it. I was like, it's so cool. Like these solutions that you're applying have so many different applications to them, and you get to tell a story, you get to work with those customers. And then when you actually do something that works for them and you get to tell that story, I mean, they light up. And it's just a really fulfilling experience all around. So it was those early days, right? Just seeing that the storytelling piece was a huge part of what I loved.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing that comes to mind as you were speaking for me is just the dynamic nature of what we do, right? I know for me that was one of the things that really appealed to me early, was the fact that, like you said, I had the opportunity, one day we're talking to, somebody who's, digging for oil. The next day we're talking to somebody who, makes tortillas, right? I mean, and everything in between. And to me, there's a certain aspect of that keeps us sharp. I think there's a certain aspect of that almost forces us to your point, sort of come up with, create, interesting, unique application stories, etc. So, everybody that I talk to in our profession, and frankly, everybody who I've had on this show, everybody has sort of a perspective. They have their perspective on pre-sales. In hearing that word, perspective, what would you say? Like if you could sort of narrow down some of the key things for you, what would you say your perspective on pre-sales is?
Yeah. It's a great question. So, because pre-sales is so broad. So like when you ask somebody, and I think this is funny, I think there was a poll today with the pre-sales collective of like, if you could pick one title for the pre-sales profession, what would it be? Like sales engineer, solutions consultant, solutions architect, whatever.
Wow.
And with that, each of those titles have different scopes and apertures of what they do and how they fit into an organization. Yeah. For me personally, I think that so for me, pre-sales is essentially like at its best, you sit between everything. Yes, you're a sales focused kind of new business development, kind of customer facing type role. So you're kind of like sales and marketing to an extent, a bit of customer success if you kind of have that in your organization and you're maybe fitting into upsell, cross-sell, those kind of relationship building type exercises with your existing customer base. But I think the best part about pre-sales is because then the product super well, the applications of it, all of that. It's like, okay, well, why are you not involved with product conversations? Why are you not feeding that back into different use cases, the questions that customers are asking, those sorts of things, right? So you've got kind of a product hat that you wear. That marketing piece as far as like content, go-to-market strategy, the conversations that you're having, and maybe like the seeds you're sowing out in the market for what your product or your solution does. You then have a great lens and a great kind of feedback loop for those teams. If you're super technical and you've got the kind of chops to go into kind of the engineering side of it, you can then even start to dig a layer deeper past that product and start to feed that back into engineering. Hey, when I go through and I'm setting up, X, Y, and Z part of our solution, these integration paths, whatever, we're missing this. And I know that we need X, Y, and Z. The pre-sales person is going to be the person feeding that back into the organization. And then even the other side for me, and one of the things that I love about my current job is new employee onboarding. So oftentimes people who are coming in, whatever their role is with the business, they need to know about the product. They need to know about the solution. They need to know about what the story of the company is. And I think pre-sales are kind of the people who can do that best in a lot of ways. And they can have a great impact of kind of synthesizing like, yes, for us, it's like, yes, we're an insurance technology company. We do core platform. Okay, well, what does core platform mean? We sit in the insurance industry, so you have to understand insurance operations, but we're also technologists, we're software people. And so how does all of that fit together? What's the story? What's the why behind the company? And, I get to tell that. And I think that's, one of the more impactful things for anyone coming into the business. So long-winded answer, but hopefully that kind of helps, share some perspective from my perspective.
Yeah, no, I absolutely love it. And, there's a couple things that you said that I want to double click on. First of all, you used the word impact a couple of times. And I think for a lot of us, we long to feel as though we're making an impact on the organization, maybe our customers, right? Society, right? At whatever scale. And I do believe that as a sales engineer, we have the opportunity to make such an impact, not only in the organizations that we work for, but with the customers and the prospects that we have the opportunity to work with. Is that one of the things you think that drew you to the profession?
Absolutely. No, you're not just sitting behind a desk crunching the numbers. Like you get to see it. You have the conversations as they're coming into the business.
Yeah.
Typically, you're there for the handoff of them to the operation side. And, again, if you're in that customer success life cycle, then you're having conversations with them after go live. And like, they know your face. They trust you, I think, a lot more than they trust the sales rep in some circumstances to kind of shoot them straight on things. And I think that's a fun place to be.
Yeah, yeah. The other thought that came to mind as you were speaking, particularly for someone who maybe isn't in the profession, right? Maybe, we might have a mechanical engineer or a software engineer listening to this and hearing some of the things you said. You got another product, you might have to talk, might have to help marketing, you got to speak to the customer, you might have to do, like, there's so many things that we are expected to do. And I know one of the things you and I talked about sort of offline was sort of the elevation of the role, or what seems to be sort of an increase in certainly awareness in the profession, and really sort of an elevated sort of state for this role. Why do you think that is, and what have you seen, over the past couple of years, in your position?
Yeah. So I think in a broader scale, the low-hanging fruit of the software industry has kind of been taken, right? So a lot of the easy things that people wanted to come in, maybe the foundational pieces of what technology is there to support, it's been accomplished, right? There's great solutions out there. I mean, you look at Salesforce. I think Salesforce is like the prime example of this. Their CRM is the best of the best. Everyone tries to chase after it. It can do so many things. Then you see now you've got all of these other kind of point solutions that are then building on top of the Salesforce ecosystem. Lean Data, for instance, they're out there in kind of the lead to account routing in the ABM space. You've then got 6sense who's feeding in, kind of meta details and things, search that's going on externally, how that's impacting then your accounts, where your sales reps should be kind of focusing within their territory. I mean, you're then kind of coming up with these deeper level solutions that are harder, kind of top of the tree fruits that you're having to go up and pick. And so from the pre-sales role, you have to understand all of that. You have to be the expert who kind of sees the entire system for what it is. And I think like my engineering background kind of fits that of, okay, understand the solution, see kind of like what are the ins and then what are the outs that you're driving towards, and then understand the in-between, so that way you can kind of yield what you want on the back end or put the right things in on the front end. And that's pre-sales. And so as it gets more and more complicated, the need for pre-sales to tell those stories, to dig a layer deeper, to be those maybe product-led type individuals for the business, that it's not just the salesperson getting out there and maybe, saying, hey, let's kind of go through the traditional sales exercise. It's somebody who can truly understand problems and show that within a solution. I think that's what we're seeing start to emerge. And that's kind of where that role of pre-sales is really, I think, championing the cause, right?
Yeah.
Some people are doing, product-led things through the website, teasers, trial periods have always been kind of a thing to kind of get people in. But I think the true kind of spearhead of any sort of product-led approach is pre-sales. It's the people who will go out and give those presentations and answer all the questions that customers are going to have.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. You've used a couple of really powerful analogies. One being this notion of the low-hanging fruit. I haven't thought about that, but you're right. I mean, some products, sort of, particularly the product-led growth organizations, that there are some solutions out there that fall into that sort of low-hanging fruit category. You can probably pick it up, start using it. Maybe you need a little bit of help. But I love this image that you've created of, the sales engineers. They're going to help you get the tasty fruit up at the top of the tree, right? And that's not something that's easy to navigate on your own. You've mentioned a couple of times now sort of the sales, and look, we see this a lot. Look, I deal with a lot of sales professionals. it's unfair, right? Sales professionals are, quote, guilty until proven innocent in the
Yep.
eyes of our customers, as I like to say, right? Like, people just tend to distrust sales, and they tend to trust the quote, the solution architect, the solution consultant, sales engineer more. That can be a challenge, or put some strain on the AE-SE relationship. What's some of the advice that you give your SCs in dealing with their sales counterparts effectively?
Yeah. Shoot, this is there's a lot of paths to go down. I think the foundation of it is just essentially the relationship that you create. Within my current organization, right? There's, like, I'll give an example. There's an individual, a sales rep that I worked with. We will butt heads constantly on our deals, right? We're always kind of at tension. It's a natural tension. It's a healthy tension. And the reason why it's a healthy tension is, we have a mutual respect for one another. We've built that. We understand how to communicate with one another throughout that tension. And that started through just kind of, time and just continuous kind of repetitive motions of having the conversations. But we'll have these contentious moments where it's like, hey, I don't think that we should maybe sell this part or do this thing or maybe do it in this way, or we're going to need to increase the scope of work. We're going to need to understand the kind of project lift that this is going to kind of put on the organization. And then their side of things is like, okay, well, that's great, but like, we need to make a sale, right? Like, we need to get this in this quarter. We need to do these kind of revenue driven, performance metrics. And it's like, okay, well then how both of those things are valid. How do you then kind of bring those together to come up with, like, essentially like what the best path forward is going to be for the business? Sometimes it's more of like my side of things wins out, but other times it's going to be sales, right? And it's important to understand that kind of relationship to be able to have that tension and to just move forward with it and come back without that being necessarily like a damaged exercise, if you will.
Yeah. I by the way, you were talking about storytelling, and that's a great example of leveraging a story. And I think it's a great example. In fact, as you were speaking, I was thinking to myself, I do think that there's such a thing as, maybe, quote, some healthy tension was the word you used, but it begins by mutual respect. You said that there's a two-way mutual respect. You respect each other's positions, opinions, and you're willing to have a conversation. I really do think that as sales engineers, we need sales to help us think bigger, right? Sort of grow out of some of our, very strict lanes, so to speak. But sales needs us, right, to keep them sort of grounded. And it really is. I mean, it's a cliche, but I think it's very true. 1 + 1 really is more than 2 when it's an effective partnership and an effective, collaboration. So I think that's critically important. I want to shift a little bit. I mean, incidentally, let me pause just for a moment, folks. I'm speaking with Bryan Karr. He is a director of pre-sales with Insurium. He runs his own career coaching business, and he's an ambassador with Presales Collective. By all means, if you want to say hello, if you have any questions for myself or Bryan, please ask. So if I may, Bryan, let's talk a little bit about some of the career coaching you're doing. And I know you've been on both sides of this, right? So obviously you've had to interview, you've been coaching and helping people go through the hiring and interview process. You've also been on the hiring side as the individual actually doing some hiring. So let's start with the folks that you're coaching. What is some of the advice that you're giving people, maybe earlier in their career? Maybe they haven't broken into pre-sales yet and they're looking to break into pre-sales. What's some of the advice you give them?
Yeah. So what I will say is, I think the leading advice that's out there right now is that, like, your resume is like what you should be leading with. It's like the end all be all. It's, what you're going to rely on. It's the bedrock of everything that you're going to do. And, like, I think that that's actually wrong. I think that's flipped. I think it's, the cherry on top of the sundae. It's the, it's the roof over the house. It's important. It's great. It makes, what it is kind of full and complete. But truly at the foundation, I think, for anyone who's going out and looking for a job, it's coming back to this idea of like a narrative and again, storytelling, right? It's the story that you're going to tell throughout that. And kind of any conversation that you ever have when you're looking for a job, there's realistically two questions that come up from the very beginning, and they're going to be a continuous theme throughout every conversation that you have after that initial like screening exercise, the initial conversation you have with the hiring manager, whatever it is. It's, who are you? Like, tell me a little bit about yourself. And then the other one is like, why are you interested in this company? What is it about us that fits into whatever kind of thing that you're looking for next? And why is this going to be a good fit? Right. And so who are you? Why us? Those are the two questions. And I think if you have a good story, right, everyone has their past experiences. They don't, especially for early career, their experiences that are like rarely directly applicable to that next job that they're looking for. I always kind of laugh when I look at, any sort of job description, because it just seems like a gross, just like overstatement of like what's required to actually be good in a role. But if you can tell a good story about what your experiences is, like why it fits into the job, and then ultimately what you're looking for in the next job and how all of that fits together into a continuous kind of exercise, like you can create a really good interview experience for yourself, and you'll be able to kind of weave that, and you become, as anyone would say with like storytelling, you become more memorable throughout the whole experience. And that's important.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm reminded of an interview that I sat through, and it was a very informal interview. In fact, I think I had a good friend who and I'll leave the name of the company out, but they're a company that everybody would instantly recognize. And I had a good friend who worked there, and he said, why don't you just go, and I think we met for lunch. And to your point, he literally said, just tell me your story. I was like, for a second, I wasn't sure what he was like. He's like, look, he said, Chris, everyone has a story. Everyone has a career story. And he was very transparent with me. He said, what I look for is a thread that makes sense through the career decisions that you've made. And I'm looking for that story. And does the position that we're hiring for, does this seem like the next logical like chapter in your story, or does this seem like you're writing a new book, right? Or does it seem like you've gone and say, by the way, zigzagging is not necessarily the worst thing in the world, but I think that's what you're talking about, right? Which is what is your story? And I think the message is if you're looking for a job, don't begin by a piece of paper with your resume and start throwing that out. Start with really thinking through like what is your story, right? I think that's what you're saying, right?
Absolutely. And like I think from my personal experience with that, it was like when I switched from hardware to software, right? It's like why would a software organization want to hire me into an experienced pre-sales role if all I've ever touched is hardware? Well, it's because like the story that you can tell about like, well, this like it's apples to apples, right? Like it's the experience that I've had working with these customers selling hardware solutions in this way is the exact same as going out and talking about, incentive compensation management, how you're paying your sales reps and the software and how that automates the entire thing. It's the exercise. And if you can explain that, you tell the story, people will become comfortable with what is maybe different about you, or maybe falls outside of the lines of what they would have considered typical for their ideal candidate profile. And I think that's much like any sort of pre-sales exercise, like what the pre-sales profession also is on a daily basis. Customers come to you with their ideal customer or their ideal kind of solution profile, what they think that they want. And your job is to explain to them actually what they truly need and how that looks. And interviewing is just the same.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. By the way, my good friend, Andy, good to see you, buddy. Thanks for chiming in. He's basically saying something very similar, right? Creating that memorable experience during the interview process. And in essence, like you said, you carry that storytelling model into your job because that's what we do. And in fact, it's interesting, and there's such a fine line. But as you were talking, I found myself thinking, to a certain degree, when you're giving maybe a presentation, a demonstration, it's sort of like you're continuously going through an interviewing process, right? In our role. as a pre-sales professional. What are some of the mistakes that you're seeing? Let's start with those of us who are maybe being interviewed. What are some of the mistakes that you're seeing people make, either in the sort of the job hunt process and or the actual interview process?
Sure. So and I know I brought up at the front end how like resumes are kind of the support structure. It's kind of the last piece. But if you think about it, and if you ever looked at somebody's resume before, there's kind of two ways to think about a resume. You can either put down every experience that you've ever had, every function, everything that you've done, the actions that you take day in and day out with your job to try and get somebody to understand the value that you bring in an organization. Or there's the people who put three, and this is kind of my mentality, is like write a couple sentences, say, hey, this is what I do. You put three maybe supporting bullets of like accomplishments, things that you're proud of, things that fill into the story that you're trying to tell. And you use that. You don't have to tell them everything. And this goes back to solution selling, right? You don't go into a new business cycle with a new customer or a new prospect and say, hey, this is everything that we do, everything under the sun that you could ever accomplish with our solution.
At least we shouldn't be.
What was that?
I said, at least we shouldn't be.
We shouldn't be, right? But that's what people do with like their resume. And then throughout the interview process is like, here's all the things I've done. Here's everything that you can do with me. Here's like kind of the scatter shot of like what I could bring your organization.
Yeah.
And as an interviewer, you're kind of overwhelmed by that. You're like, hey, like that's a lot. Like, I don't understand how all of these pieces fit into like I just needed a sliver of what you all do, or like of what you do as a candidate. And that's where like that storytelling exercise of a couple little things. Hey, this is what we do, kind of broadly speaking. Yeah. I've understood kind of through a little bit of research about the company, maybe about what the role is. Yeah. Look, I think these are three stories that you're going to really like. Three things that I've accomplished that I think fit right in. And here's why. Here's why I'm going to tell you that those are important to what the role is and what I'm trying to accomplish with your business. Yeah. And you kind of put it out on the lines that way. You don't tell them everything that you've ever done and give them the full kind of, biography of yourself.
And the Harbor Tour demo. I mean, that's what we're talking about, right? Like don't give the Harbor Tour demo in the context of interview. Bryan, we actually have a few questions flying in very quickly. Yeah. The first is from Chris G. First of all, Chris, good to see you. IT leadership for 15 years, and sounds like he does a lot of, quote, selling and pitching internally. Any suggestions on how he can get into tech sales? I certainly do, but Bryan, since you're particularly the expert in this, Chris, thank you for your question. Any thoughts? And we have a few more questions. Any thoughts from you, Bryan?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think you're in a great spot, right? So I think there's two paths into pre-sales. You can either be the really strong seller who learns product, which is arguably the harder path, or you can be the kind of technology engineer, IT person, implementation maybe, that says, hey, I want to get into sales, and I've been able to pitch and present products and solutions internally or externally to customers, and I want to kind of exercise that. I think that's a great place to be where you're at, because you understand what it is you're trying to accomplish. You understand the back end. I think for you, it's then, okay, over those last 2 years, what are those experiences? Like, come up with a couple of those stories of like when that makes sense, and how maybe those stories will transfer to this like new business development type role. And then the other side of this is, and this is really the key if you're making any sort of like career pivot, that's not like that next natural progression and kind of the, Chris, to your point, right? That stream that you're on is, okay, I need to go out and I need to start talking to some people, and I'm going to start to create some champions and convince some other people that will then say to, the hiring manager, the recruiter, whoever it is, like, hey, I know that this person looks a little bit different, but they've told me a great story. They get what, the whole process is about. I think that they could be a really strong fit. And then you build that. And that's ultimately the other side of how I switched from hardware to software, was a bit of that. I had 5 or 10 conversations with people before
Yeah.
I even touched an interview cycle at the company that basically then were like, hey, I know he looks different, but he totally gets it. And we want him on the team because of, all of these reasons. And I think that's the other
Yeah.
important piece of the puzzle is kind of the networking effect. And then,
Yeah.
ultimately it's stuff that pays dividends down the road
Yeah.
too.
Yeah. It's incredibly well said. Chris G, I'll add to Brian's comments simply by saying this. I was 15 years into an IT career before I moved into pre-sales. And my advice for you is first and foremost, focus on where your expertise is. If you've been doing this for 15 years, clearly you have an expertise. And then I would start looking at those software companies that sell software, provide software in that space where you're an expert. And certainly connect Chris G. If we're not connected on LinkedIn, reach out, and I'm happy to connect you with a lot of hiring managers. I know a lot of people, needless to say. Bryan, there's another interesting question, and you sort of touched on this, and I believe it's Adeola, but if I'm not saying that Adeola, please accept my apology. She's in traditional sales and trying to transition into a tech sales role. Any advice? Again, Bryan, I'll let you take a stab at that first. Any thoughts come to mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where knowing, me being in kind of a solutions consulting role is a little bit detached from, because I know that true sales personalities, the way that they look at things is going to be a little bit different. But I think there it's just finding people who maybe similar sales structure, similar sales methodologies. If you follow the ICE method, or I'm trying to remember some of the other ones that are out there, right? You kind of find that profile, and then you can then articulate to them, hey, I've done this. I know this kind of exercise. I think sales is 2 parts. It's a process, and it's also a little bit of kind of, artistic flair that falls into it, but mostly it's process, right? If you can follow a good process, I think if you're a natural seller, you'll mix in your artistic flair and it'll become a natural thing for you. And so,
Yeah.
kind of maybe leaning on that process piece is where I would say, and finding people who can kind of similarly align to that at some of those organizations.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. And I'll sort of amplify that. And again, I hope I'm saying it right. Adiola is similar to what I mentioned to Chris G. Where is your expertise? And where is your passion and where is your expertise? One place, if you're in sales and you want to get into a pre-sales role, go talk to a company that sells to sellers, right? There's all kind of sales tech out there, marketing tech out there. You will more than likely understand who you're selling to very well. That's a good place to begin. I just want to recognize a few more comments. We got a comment from Jennifer. Great discovery is such an indispensable skill with whether it's interviews, the sales process. Jennifer, I could not agree more. And I love your final sentence there. Remain curious. I don't know if you've watched Ted Lasso, but there's this dart scene where he says, "Be curious, not judgmental." It's one of my favorite little things. And again, just another question from, or I think it's Irina. I hope I'm saying that right, Irina. Do you think a good solution consultant has to be an engineer before anything else? Really good question. I have an opinion, Bryan, but I'm going to ask you. I think the question is, do good solution consultants have to be engineers first?
I don't think so. I think you have to find the organization that fits you. So for instance, one stage in my career, and, I had an interview with a company called Datadog. They're a great company, super strong. The solutions consulting role was way more technical than I wanted to take on. They wanted people who had that engineering background. It kind of naturally fits what their product is and what it serves.
Yeah.
And so I've always, in any of my roles, searched for less technical, kind of more, we'll call it business acumen led pre-sales types roles. Where, you need to be able to understand kind of the technical, you need to be able to speak to what an API is or how integration paths are going to be built, or whatever. But it's more about the business exercise of like, okay, what's the value? How do I understand this? How do I then speak to the story of how this fits into what you're all trying to accomplish?
Yeah.
And truly understanding that. And so I don't think you have to be an engineering kind of technical person. You just have to find the right company that's hiring for that right type of like SC or SE type role. And
Yeah.
those ultimately come from you just knock on some people's doors on LinkedIn and ask them like, hey, what's it like? Like, what do you do? What's your
Yeah.
role? And just kind of search it out that way, come up with a list of 5 companies and go after them.
Yeah. Well, and I'll submit, I mean, and this is the classic pre-sales answer. I'll submit that I think it depends, right? It depends on the company. I mean, there are plenty of high-tech companies out there where you do have to have the quote technical chops, as I like to say, to even get a foot in the door. I mean, and it's a big part of it is who are you selling to, right? If you're selling artificial intelligence software to data scientists, you're going to need a pretty deep data science background in order to be able to have the conversation, right? But if you're selling, a sales tech to sales leaders and sales professionals, then you may not need to have that strong engineering background. So I really think it's a mix is the feedback that I get to people. Make no mistake, to me, most companies they're looking for a certain level of technical expertise depending on their particular space. So really good question, folks. Thank you so much. And of course, we're happy to take more. Bryan, let's shift gears just a little bit. We talked about the interview process a little bit from the side of the candidate. Let's talk about it from the side of the actual hiring manager, the hiring organizations. In fact, before we go there, when did you make the shift from individual contributor into management yourself?
Yeah, so that's actually a pretty recent thing over the last, basically year. I've kind of been in that transition from individual contributor into kind of more of, director of, solutions consulting, right? Like
And
that type.
what have you, since it's reasonably new, then what have you learned in the past year that maybe sort of, maybe took you by surprise a little bit, or what were some of the things that you didn't expect but now understand about this role?
Yeah. I think so. For a long time as an individual contributor, you kind of think about things as like, you've got your own world and your own things and like your own process and procedure for doing that stuff. And like what is best practice and how you get to do what you want to do. When you make that transition, you have to then justify why that's the best practice for not just yourself, right? Because like you can have it be for yourself at an individual contributor level, but why you might need to implement that to other people. Why the way that you talk about it is better than a different, or to from a curiosity perspective, to Jennifer's piece, right? Learning and understanding how other people are doing it, maybe setting your ego aside and saying, okay, well, shoot, they might actually have a better perspective, or maybe we can do a hybrid and a combination. And I think that's kind of the biggest transition is like, it stops just being about yourself and you have to start to see like the larger picture beyond you and what you're doing as it relates to process and selling.
I mean, I think what you said right there is probably the most significant thing, right? It's no longer just about you, right? It's no longer about just you performing and doing your thing, right? Now, success is now defined by the success of the team, right? And I think that's a critical thing. So what have you learned from the perspective of being the interviewing manager, and or what is some of the advice that you're giving to maybe some of the hiring managers out there that you're working with?
Yeah. So I think this is actually a piece of advice that I got recently. Talking with some recruiters is, I think it's a make or break, right? So we've seen a bit of a pendulum shift as far as like who's got the power in the hiring process over the last year or two, especially with the pandemic. And there's some funny things there, and that's a larger conversation about like, what is the Great Resignation? Why is the Great Resignation kind of existing? And like, what is the reshuffle that's going on? I think part of that, and this was the piece of advice that I got from the recruiter, was your experience as a candidate is kind of built upon the way that you're interacted with by the managers and by the recruiters. And so if anyone has ever gone through a hiring process, more chances, more times than not, I would say that somebody's experienced a bad recruiter, right? Where you're just like, it's like pulling teeth. You feel like you're doing their job. They keep, scheduling things when they shouldn't be scheduling things. You send over your block of times and they pick a block of times that's outside of that. And you're like, like this is just exhausting. The same goes for like hiring managers of like actually being present and being involved in those conversations and throughout every interview. And it's not easy. It's not great. It's not, sometimes you sit down, you have a conversation with somebody and it just doesn't click. Instead of maybe like pulling back away from that and maybe giving them this impression that like they're doing things wrong or you're not enjoying it or whatever, it's kind of maybe a little bit more of leaning in and being like, okay, let's be hopeful that this could be a really strong candidate. How do I maybe pull a little bit more out of them, create a little bit more comfort for them, give them maybe the impression that, I don't know. And it's tough to give like maybe a concrete example without like a true kind of use case around it, but it's just, there's an onus as a hiring manager to be fully immersed into the process. And I think it's tough when you do the same thing over and over and over again with every single candidate. It can be a bit exhausting, and I'm sure it's kind of like being a buyer for software, right? It's like sitting through, 6 demos from 6 different companies and seeing essentially 6 of the same things over and over again. You kind of, I don't know, you get a little exhausted by it. So.
Yeah. No, I mean, your words resonate with me a great deal, actually. I will admit that the part of being a sales or SE leader myself was the hiring process. And if I'm fully transparent, it was not my strong suit. I didn't love going through the process. I wanted a quick solution. And I'm the first to admit there were a few hires that I made because I was sort of giving the person the benefit of the doubt. And I just wanted, I was projecting something that, may or may not have been reality. And I was eager to just get the process done and find someone. So I think it's a skill. I think it's an important skill that people need to develop. And you're right. It is like buying a solution, right? In essence, that's what you're doing, right? You're paying for a solution to, I've said at times in my career, like every job is a problem, right? Yeah. The reason there is a job is because some organization has a problem that they need to fix and they need to solve, right? And that's sort of the attitude that we have to bring to every sales, or every interview, right?
Right. And that's where, to that end, and this is kind of where maybe I'll jump in and help clarify my thoughts. I don't think I did the best explaining it, is in that way. It's like everyone who's ever been in like a pre-sales or a selling exercise, you've had the great customer interactions where it's like, you come in, you tell your story, you do your thing, and they respond to that positively. Or when you ask them questions, you feel like they're bought into trying to like get through the process with you and to make it as meaningful as possible and to give you the opportunity to show what you're really trying to show up to do. And we've also had, the same, I always think of, the Northeast CFO, right? Like kind of the New York CFO guy, where you ask a question and you get, yep, nope, sure. And you're like, I'm wanting to get you bought in. And those are hard because you don't know where you stand. You don't know if your presentation is hitting with them and like is what they want to hear, or if like maybe you could shift it in the moment and give them like a different perspective to truly understand. And that's where I think a good candidate's asking the questions is being, doing their discovery throughout it. But it also relies on a hiring manager to be involved, to lean into that, and to give those bits of feedback to help coach them along maybe throughout the process.
Yeah. Well, and it's like Jennifer mentioned a moment ago, great discovery, right? I mean, every conversation should begin with a little bit of discovery of our own to understand and get some context. And I think I understand what you're saying is that and I think it's probably more true than ever before, is that as a hiring manager, part of what you're doing is also selling yourself and selling your organization. And we do that by being an actively engaged participant in the conversation.
Yeah. And if it's a problem that that person's being hired to solve, they need to understand what the problem is that you're hiring them to be the solution for. And so if you're not helping them understand that, then I think you're doing a disservice to the candidate that's coming in, and you're going to have a bad hire potentially, and that's obviously not a good thing from a financials perspective.
Indeed. Bryan, we're believe it or not, we've been chatting for about 45 minutes, and I've got a bit of a lightning round that I want to get to here in a minute. Before I do, I just want to ask you a little bit more about the career coaching business that you're doing. Are you working primarily with early career individuals? Are you working with people who are not in pre-sales but want to get into pre-sales, in pre-sales and want to advance? Like what are sort of the, what's the ideal profile if someone might be interested in talking to you?
Yeah, ultimately it's just if they're wanting to make a change and do something different. I think technology is something that I have a foundation around, so I can understand the software tech industry, understand the hardware industry. But I mean, there's a woman who wanted to change from a claims management role to an underwriting role last year that I worked with, and we got her sourced in, and she's got a great job now and made that career pivot. And so, it's kind of whatever as far as like who I'm working with. I just enjoy kind of the experience, and I think anything that I bring to the table is transferable from industry to industry.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It's interesting. Someone said to me a number of years ago, in fact, I was changing jobs, and the lady I was working for at the time, she said, "Look, Chris," and she was sad to see me go, but she said, "Look, Chris, everyone is the CEO of their own career. And I know you got to do," and I just thought, man, those words are so powerful. Everyone is the CEO of their own career. And look, folks, I'll say it took me until I launched my training business about 2 years ago, full time, and I was over the age of 50 when I did so. So it took me a full on, 50 years of life to really get to that point. And similar to what you've been talking about, Bryan, every step, as I reflect on my career, every step was an important step in the journey, right? And I sort of had this desire building within inside of me to ultimately do what I did, right? But it took time to get there, right? And I would like to believe I was somewhat strategic in what I did, and there were other decisions that go into it. But I think I'm inspired to just leave the thought for everyone that, look, you are the CEO of your own career, and only you know what's in your heart of hearts, what's best for you, and it's a journey, right? It takes a number of steps along the way. So Bryan, there's just a few more questions I want to ask sort of in this lightning round. The first question, this program I'm calling Tech Sales Advice. As you reflect on your career, what's the best, or can you think of one of the best pieces of advice you've ever received, particularly from a sales context, a sales, pre-sales perspective?
Yeah. I'm still terrible at it, but say less. That's like, I think one of the best things is there's an opportune time when somebody asks a question. And I know I kind of made fun of like the New York CFO a little bit with the like yes or no responses, but sometimes people ask a question and the best answer is just like, yeah, we do that. Totally, 100%. Like we can, we have customers who do that. And just leaving it as simple of an answer as that. I think in technology sales, and whether it's as a seller or in pre-sales, you want to show, you want to explain, you think that by going beyond, you can create more comfort. But sometimes it's best just to keep it simple and not maybe belabor a point.
Absolutely. And if I can sort of between the lines a little bit. The opposite is they ask a question and you're like, oh yeah, let me show you. Click, click, click,
Yeah.
click, 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 click. Right. And after 10 minutes, the person goes, so the answer was yes.
Yep.
By the way, I have a little system I call the Checkdown System. You get one of those questions, verbal response first, visual evidence second if they press, and vivid detail if and only if it's warranted. I call it the 3 V's. So that resonates with me a great deal. And I can only assume that maybe you learned that the hard way, because a few times maybe you went a little bit too deep and somebody said, just a simple yes or no will suffice.
Yep. Yeah. And it happens.
So the question number 2, let's turn the tables. If someone were to come to you and say, Bryan, we've only got 2 minutes, but what advice would you give for me as I enter the role of technical sales for the first time?
So I followed a couple of like sales personalities on LinkedIn. One of these guys, Keenan, gave a great piece of advice last week that I think resonates really well with pre-sales, but just life in general. And his whole thing was just learn to learn, right? And it's this idea that learning is a skill. Pre-sales, you have to learn, and you have to learn a lot of stuff. And you then have to be able to shrink that, everything that you've learned down into like quick little sound bites, the articulate answers to the questions that people come up with. And so learning to learn, I think, is like the biggest thing, because then, new products come along, new solutions come along, you change jobs down the road, whatever, you're going to have to learn something new. And the better you can be at that, the better of like a solutions consultant, a sales engineer, whatever your role is, you can be.
I absolutely love that. Learn to learn. It's funny, Bryan, and I tell people that attend my workshops, like, folks, I am still learning and practicing and developing all of the habits and principles that I wrote about in the book and talked about. And in fact, that's why habit number 6 is to perfect. Because the truth is you'll never there's no such thing as reaching perfection. Right? It doesn't mean we stop trying, right? It doesn't mean that we never stop trying and learning. The moment you stop learning, I think the moment you stop living. I absolutely love that. Very good. All right, final question, Bryan.
Sure.
If you could ask me one question, what might that be?
Did you ever do something that you were just like saw no value in and you just like wish that you could just trim out? Was there any part of your career that you were just like, net zero or net negative value to the next step in things? I think I know the answer and I kind of have my perspective on it, but I'll let you.
Wow. So first of all, I gotta say, in fact, when I run my workshops, I toss out a poker chip for people when they ask a particularly good question, or I'd be tossing you a poker chip for that question. That's a good question. I'm gonna say I don't think so. There are some regrets, maybe, but. And are there some jobs that maybe didn't work out ideally? Yes, but anything that feels like, I don't remember the exact words that you use, but anything that just seems like, sort of like a net null, so to speak. No, I think as I reflect on my career and my journey, really in life, but certainly in my career, every step had a purpose. Every step, there was a lesson to be learned in every step, and it became part of who I was and what I learned along the way, and enabled me to do finally what it was that I did. And look, I made a couple of, I started a couple or tried a couple of business ventures that cost me a lot of money and didn't go well. And so one might argue, well, that was a fail. But it wasn't a fail, it was a tuition. What I paid was tuition, and it was a valuable lesson.
Yeah.
So that's what comes to mind for me is I just think every step was an important step along the way.
Yeah. No, and I figured that would be the answer, and this kind of the perspective I take and I try and instill in people is whether it's a job shift, it's a new role, it's a what like it just nothing bad has ever come. Like I've always had something positive that's built along the way, and it's never been a step backwards to do
Yeah.
something different, to try something new, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
So
yeah. No, that's really well said. And the other thought that comes to mind for me is I would much rather get to the end of my career and look back and say, well, I made these decisions and that maybe they didn't go precisely as I thought, but at least I tried, rather than looking back and saying I didn't take a chance. Right? To me, there's much more satisfaction knowing that, hey man, I left it all in the field. I took advantage of the opportunities that came my way. I took some chances. One of the things, and I'll sort of close my thoughts with this. Well, in fact, I tell my kids this all the time. If you get invited to do something, unless you have a good reason to say no, the answer is always yes. Why? Because invitations only come around so much, right? They only come around so often. And I mean, that's what life is, right? And by the way, the universe, I believe in the universe, right? And the more we say yes to opportunities that come our way, regardless of what it is, meet me for a cup of coffee or what have you, right? The more opportunities will come your way. But the more we say no, I think the universe says, you know what, this person doesn't want to engage. And the fewer they become. So anyway, good question, Bryan. You inspired me to share something I haven't thought about in a while. Bryan, any final thoughts for you as we close things out?
No, this has been an awesome conversation. I love the opportunity, and I'm glad that we got to do it. And I think it kind of, I'm just thrilled to have had the time today. So
awesome. Well, Bryan, thank you. You've been a gracious guest. Thank you to those of you who joined us. If you're still hanging around, appreciate it. If you happen to have listened to the video, the recording, and you've stuck around, thank you as well. You can find Bryan, of course, online. Check out his BCK Careers website. And of course, I know some of you likely follow him on the Presales Collective. Bryan, thank you very much, sir. Enjoy the rest of the week and good luck this year. And I'm sure we'll talk soon. Folks, and incidentally, if you want to check these out, #TechSalesAdvice, follow the hashtag and you can catch all of these. We'll see you next time. Thanks all.